Well, hi again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of 100 Yards of Football. This is our Legends edition, and you may notice that our co-host and founder, Vincent Turner, is not with us today. Brian LeBel is replacing him. Vincent's on assignment, so to speak. He's got the day off and be spending it with family in Tennessee in the 901. You all know about that, and he's there. So we wish Vincent well and have safe and happy travels with your family. And when you come back, we certainly will welcome you. Brian, we're going to talk today about a guy, but first let me introduce Jeremiah Long, our producer and engineer. He's got some pictures, and people will instantly notice that this guy was one of the ones that made a difference. As soon as he joined the football team in the city of Pittsburgh, they were already good, but they became great when Jack Lambert became a part of the Pittsburgh Steelers in 1974.
Well, he kind of became the face of that defense too, the steel curtain defense, with what he was able to do, which is crazy to think about how much talent they had on that roster. And if you think of great defenses all time, they're one of the two or three guys. Now, if you're the Ravens, you probably don't want to bring them up. You're probably going to talk about your 2000 team. And if you're the Steelers, obviously you're not going to bring up the Ravens. So those two are kind of mutually exclusive. But the 85 Bears, the 77 Falcons might be the best all time. But the Steelers did it for a decade. It was domination. It was almost painful to watch if you're on the other team, right? I mean, it was brutal. It was smash mouth football. It was every single yard was earned, and Jack Lambert was right in the middle of that. I mean, he was maybe the most important part of it, and it happy to be talking about him today.
If you're Cincinnati, if you're Cleveland, if you're Houston, Kansas City, Buffalo, Baltimore, back in the day when Baltimore was still there, some of the rivalries, but especially if you're an Oakland Raider fan, my goodness, playing against the Steelers from the mid 70s to the late 70s, it was a heartache for you in many different ways. Now, the Raiders ended up beating them. Denver ended up beating them one year, and each of them went to and won Super Bowls. But Miami Dolphins fans know that after they won two, they went to three in a row, by the way. Miami was an amazing team in the early 70s. But boy, the rivalry there was absolutely amazing. Well, John Harold Lambert, also known as Jack, was born on July 8th, 1952, in a small Ohio town. Minot was the name of the town. It's kind of halfway between Cleveland and Youngstown. Kind of a farm area, if you will. Even if you go there today, there's probably only two stop signs. So it's a little place where he ended up growing up and getting a chance to be athletic. He was 6'3" by the time he was in high school. He was a quarterback. He played cornerback too on defense. We'll talk about that in just a second. But Jack had very humble beginnings. His mom said that when he worked on his grandfather's farm, back when he was probably 10, 12, 14, he got country strong. He would be baling hay and working all the chores and doing some things that young boys do when they're working on a farm. But the humble beginnings, really from an athletic perspective, he played all kinds of sports, and especially football when he was growing up, baseball. He was a very good basketball player too. But initially, Brian, there were some things about Jack Lambert that you think about, well, this could be anybody. And there's nothing really, as a quarterback, back in those days, you pretty much handed the ball off. So, and he wasn't a prolifically strong runner. His high school coach said when he played cornerback, he had four defensive backs, and Jack was the slowest of the four. So he didn't have great speed, at least not when he was 15, 16, 17 years of age. But he was strong physically and very strong in between the ears.
I think playing multiple positions growing up, and I think having to adapt, I think having to learn different play styles probably helps shape you in a better way later on. I think, playing cornerback, learning how to play in the secondary, obviously it makes it a lot easier when you're playing linebacker because you kind of get to take bits and pieces, and mesh them together. And I think it helps make you a better all-around player, which I think Jack Lambert was a phenomenal all-around player. He was, go from a guy playing in the secondary to be able to play around the line of scrimmage, and the way he did play around the line of scrimmage, he was violent, he was nasty. I mean, we talked a little bit, I alluded to it earlier. That Steelers defense was nasty, and Jack, he was the focal point of it. I think if you go the highlights that you have, right, the NFL Films highlights you have, you picture the music and you picture like what they're doing in the slow motion and how they got away with it. Everybody was injured on that team, right? So everybody's wearing a club. Everybody's got different things. It makes it a little bit, easier for them to swing and to hit you and knock the ball a little bit loose. But I mean, what he was able to do, and he was able to take the lessons he learned from being maybe a slower guy, say, hey, maybe I'm not the fastest guy here, so I got to play a little bit smarter. Like you said, he was good between the ears, and he was able to adapt, and he translated into a great professional and collegiate career too.
Yeah. Well, he went to Crestwood High School. It's the only place in Mantua, Ohio that you can go if you're going to learn your sports. He was a catcher in baseball. And as a basketball player, he was pretty good. By the time he was a senior, he averaged 17.9 points a game, and he had about 13 rebounds. But it was in high school basketball that part of the folklore about Jack Lambert took place. A teammate of his, Steve Poling, and I were both going for a ball, and they collided. And Steve's head ends up hitting Jack right in the mouth and knocks out his 4 front teeth. And Jack was pretty sensitive about that. One day he was swimming in a pool, and his mother said his bridge came out. It fell loose, and so he lost his teeth, and he wouldn't go back to school until his teeth were replaced. But he walked around with them, but he never played with his front teeth in. And that, as the Dracula folklore went into his professional days, when the Lamberts lunatics were first starting early in the Pittsburgh folklore, Jack was a part of that as well. But as a football player, again, a quarterback on offense, so he'd hand the ball off pretty much. He wasn't really a runner per se, and then there's no stats that we have on him. But as a cornerback, a defensive back, his high school coach had said on numerous occasions, he said, and this is Gary Myers, other teams would stop running curl routes because Jack would annihilate the receiver if he ran a curl route. So he'd run right up to where Jack was, 7, 8, 10 yards off the ball, stop, turn around. And by the time the ball got to the receiver, his head was on the ground and his feet were up in the air. They stopped running routes to his side eventually as a senior. So he developed as a defensive player to be one of those guys that was really an intimidator early and often in his high school career. And he struggled a little bit, if you will, to get recruited. By the time he was a senior, his coach, who had gone to Miami of Ohio, asked the coaches there at Ohio if he could be recruited, and they declined. Wisconsin gave him a little bit of a look, but they passed on him. He was tall, he was skinny, he was considered slow, so he had a tough time making it. There were a couple of calls that were made, and one of them, one of his coaches, Coach Cox, ends up calling Dave Puddington at Kent State. And he says, listen, Coach, I know that you got a problem. Part of your issue is that you can't keep some of these Ohio kids, the good ones, in state. And here's a kid, I promise you, he's going to be a player for you. He may be a little slow where you are right now, but you will not miss. If you're going to gamble on this kid. And he was reluctant. They went on a recruiting trip, and Jack was there, but he eventually gave him a scholarship. And what a difference that made. Jack promised that he was going to be one of those guys that would make a difference. So he ends up going to Kent State. And by the way, Kent State at this time in 1970, when he was a freshman, had the incident on their campus where the 4 students were shot. There were 9 others that were injured that day. Jack was on campus. So was a guy named Nick Saban. And he was teammates with another guy named Gary Pinkel at Kent State. And Gary went on to be a head coach at Missouri. He was an assistant at the University of Washington. But Jack started out his freshman year, which you can't play, and he was a quarterback, so he didn't suit up at all. The second year, you'll see the picture in the middle down at the bottom. He ends up wearing number 99, and they move him over to defense. He plays defensive end, and he's not very impressive there. The following year, his junior year, Don James becomes the head coach at Kent State. And Don James ended up winning a national championship at the University of Washington, a fantastic coach, a guy that really knew his stuff and was able to do it at the high level. And Don James moves him to linebacker, and what a difference that made for Jack Lambert. He goes to the inside, and he ends up being a starter immediately from a defensive perspective. He had over 200 tackles his junior year. He had another 200 plus. He ended up at Kent State with over 593 tackles in the 2 years that he played. So he's averaging over 200 a year. You include that sophomore year when he moved to defensive end, but really he didn't get to play a whole heck of a lot. He wasn't a defensive end. He was out of position. But my gosh, Brian, what a difference that guy made. He gets noticed. He ends up being the MAC Player of the Year twice, Defensive Player of the Year. And what a difference. The junior year, they lose a few games early, but they go 6-4. They win the MAC conference. They go to the Tangerine Bowl for the first time in over 20 years. And the Kent State student body, the community around that, needed something to get them out of the doldrums, out of the massacre that took place just a couple of years earlier. And Jack Lambert was an integral part of that. So his career at Kent State was obviously fantastic. His number 99 was retired, but he was a difference maker as soon as he was moved. So he gives great credit and all the respect in the world to Don James for what he did in moving him to a different position and allowing him to excel.
Well, going from a guy who nobody really wanted, nobody recruited to being the player of the year in your conference, and then the Steelers drafted him. I think it was 46th overall, very, middle of the second round. He got moved around, quarterback, play defensive end. Hey, can you play linebacker? Hey, can you tackle? Hey, can you whatever? I mean, he just did whatever he was asked. I think it's just because he loved the game of football. I think he had a natural knack for it. I think if you were to ask him, I think he'd just tell you, he's like, hey man, I just want to be out on the field, and he's one of those guys that said, hey, whatever you need me to do, I'm going to give everything I got. He was nasty. He was physical, and his stats at Kent State speak for themselves, right? He go from a guy nobody wanted to being, talk of the town and one of the best defensive prospects in the draft when he became eligible to go pro.
He had a meeting with Don James when Don first got there. And in that conversation, there was a talk about school, making sure you attended your classes, making sure that, stayed on top of your homework, all the things from an academic perspective that are important for any student athlete. Jack put it this way. He said, Coach, football is too important for me to mess this thing up. I'm going to go to class and you're not going to have to worry about me, but I want to play football for you. And I want to be the best player I can possibly be. What a difference that turned out being. First team All-MAC Player of the Year, leads the conference in tackles. They went to the Tangerine Bowl. He was the MVP of that game, and that was his junior year. Senior year, they go 9-2, but 2 of those losses were in conference, so they didn't win the conference. They had the best record in program history, but they didn't go to a bowl game. But Jack, again, he was the captain of the team. He was All-MAC again, All-MAC conference. He went to the All-Ohio Shrine game. He played in that. The North-South game, the Shrine game, and the America Bowl. There were 3 different games that he got a chance to play in, and he ended up with 593 tackles, as I mentioned, the second most in Kent State history. And as I mentioned, his number 99 was retired. During that process, the games, especially his senior year, the all-star games, so to speak, the Rooney family ended up looking at this guy, not the coaching staff, the family itself. They wanted to know a little bit more about this skinny kid, and they noticed how small his legs were. They were long, but he had bird legs. But if you'll notice in any of the other pictures, the grit, the attitude, everything about what he did on the field, and the Steelers didn't really take a chance on him. Listen to this draft, Brian. Your first round is Lynn Swann. Your second round is Jack Lambert. Your third round was traded to the Raiders, and they end up picking up Mark Van Egan, who had a fantastic NFL career. Your fourth round goes to John Stallworth. Your fifth round is Mike Webster, right? Those are your 4 of your first 5 guys end up being in the Hall of Fame. And by the way, Donnie Shell was a free agent that year. He signed out of a small college, and then he ends up being the 5th Hall of Famer from the same draft class in 1974. You couldn't ask for a better draft. You couldn't ask for guys that you had to put on the field right away. Jack Lambert joins Andy Russell and a guy named Jack Ham as a linebacker on the team that was very stacked at that time. They were getting better. Henry Davis was the inside linebacker. And even though Jack Lambert was backing up Jack Ham during the preseason, Henry Davis ends up having a neck injury, and Lambert is put into the inside middle position on that 4-3 defense, and the rest is history.
Well, do we start talking about his accolades now, his professional ones? Because there's a lot to read off if you want to start going into what he accomplished. Also, that draft class, you think maybe it's one of the best ever with what the Steelers were doing? I think if you look,
how do you compare it?
Yeah.
If my numbers are 5 and you have 3 Hall of Famers, and by the way, how many Hall of Famers do average teams end up with. They're lucky if
Right.
they get a starter that's going to stay on the same team for after a first contract, 4, 5, 6 years. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but I mean, you have 4 guys, 5 guys, Hall of Fame level guys. I mean, because you only had 5, you had 4 or 5 picks back then. Was it 5 draft choices or was it only 4
No,
back then?
they had 13 that
Was
year,
it
if I'm
13?
not
Okay.
mistaken. Yeah, but there could have been a 14th, but including free agents, it doesn't matter. I'm just saying out of that class,
Yeah.
an absolute amazing number. Now the Steelers were getting better. Don't forget their first year of going to the playoffs. Everybody talks about Franco and how important Franco was to the team, and he is. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying they went to the playoffs for the first time in 72. The Immaculate Reception, they beat the Raiders. They
Yeah.
lose to the Dolphins, and the Dolphins end up being Super Bowl champs. The next year they go to the playoffs, they lose to the Raiders, and the Raiders lose to the Dolphins. Again, Miami, Super Bowl champs. The next year, this is 74, and this is where this team is building and kind of gliding themselves into their legacy.
Yeah.
Lambert comes in. I mentioned Stallworth and Swan and Webster and Shell, along with L.C. Greenwood and Holmes and Dwight White and some guy named Mean Joe Green, Ham, Russell, Blunt. They're already there, and he just is a piece that fits into that puzzle just from a defensive perspective, and they end up going to the Super Bowl and winning it in 74.
Yeah. I mean, he was. Would you say he's more of the anchor point on the defense? I mean, he was instrumental. They had guys everywhere else, but I think he was one of the first players that you bring in and say, hey, your Mike linebacker position, that's the anchor of your defense, right? That's the guy that's going to hold it down. That's the guy that can help play the run. He can get after the quarterback. He can kind of do whatever you need him to do. Because, he was he could move around a little bit. Obviously, you're not going to drop back and throw the ball, 50 times in a game on average, like you would now back in, the mid 70s. But he kind of epitomized what the position was, right? If you were to go back and talk to guys like maybe, you get like a Ray Lewis, you get some of these linebackers in the 90s and the 2000s, say, hey, who did you kind of look up to? Who would you watch film on? Who would you kind of base your game off of? I think he was the guy that a lot of those players would answer and say, hey, if you go back and watch what he did for the position, he kind of revolutionized it. He was the epitome of what you kind of wanted at the position. I mean, he was just mean. He's tough. He's nasty. You got the neck roll going. You got everything else. It's very intimidating walking out, especially having to go play in a place like Pittsburgh where it's cold. And, hey, it's freezing, it's below freezing, it's snowing, it's whatever's going on. There's freezing rain. That guy's going to be hitting me for 60 minutes. He's one of the, you want no part of that as an offensive guy. And it's, tip your cap to Jack Lambert for what he was able to do. He just loved the game, and he was able to cement what the middle linebacker position still kind of is today.
He had some speed that maybe in high school he didn't have. He was able to cover the tight end in a way that most linebackers wouldn't. You'd have an outside linebacker.
Yeah.
He would cover the one back, not the two, the first back. And that was usually a mismatch for many other different linebackers. And let's look at some of the greats that were part of, you talk about Butkus, you talk about Ray Nitschke, you talk about Mike Singletary. Well, Singletary came a little bit later. Lambert was the guy that was in the middle that basically had to tell everybody else what they needed to do when there was a shift or someone went in motion. He was the one accountable for the first voice that you heard about what are we going to do differently? We're going to go from an over to an under. Are you going to switch it? You're going to double team or be double teamed. You have to watch out for all that kind of stuff. You had Andy Russell, who wasn't the biggest guy out there, but man, he was lightning quick and fast. He would tackle you and he'd get up. Then you had Jack Ham, who was as big and strong as anybody on the outside as well. He'd tackle you, he'd get up. When Lambert tackled you, he'd push you back down on the ground. He'd point at you. He'd say something to you. He'd give you an extra shove. It didn't matter. He would tackle you long after the whistle was blown and then do even more. And the rest of the Steelers probably were sick of it at the beginning. Hey, kid, what are you doing? But it became a part of their brand, how tough they were, how fast, how physical they were. Bud Carson put together a defense. The Tampa 2 originated with Jack Lambert. The idea behind it where you could keep the safeties up and they could play closer to the line of scrimmage instead of dropping deep. I'm sorry, the cornerbacks would play up. The safeties would split wide and cover the deep portions of the field outside of the hash marks, but the middle was exposed. And offenses knew this. Lambert had the speed to get the depth that was needed, so you couldn't throw it over the middle if you had a basic cover two. So the Tampa 2, even though it was perfected in Tampa with different coordinators and Gruden and Dungy and all the other guys that were responsible for really perfecting that, but it was originated with Bud Carson in Pittsburgh. So the 74 Steelers end up winning the Super Bowl. The 75 Steelers, Mean Joe Green had an injury that kind of lingered. He missed a few games. And so people are starting to notice these guys, and they're talking about him, and they're going deep into the playoffs, and it is cold, and it's snowing. And Lambert, if you look at the picture down in the middle where he's at Kent State wearing number 99, he's got both his hands together. You never saw Jack Lambert's arms. Jerseys always went down to the forearms back in those days, and the pads that he would wear, and he'd cover himself up, and he looked a heck of a lot bigger than he was. He was 6'4", about 220, but he wasn't as muscular. I mean, don't get me wrong, he didn't have any body fat, but he wasn't as big and powerful. But he covered that up with the long jersey, with the pads that he wore underneath. But what an intimidating guy that was part of making the defense. You had to fight and earn it. They beat the Minnesota Vikings, and then they go into the game against Dallas. And you look at the bottom right-hand corner, folks, there's a picture of Jack, and he's already thrown Walt Harris down on the ground. Roy Gerela missed a field goal. And this is part of the Dallas-Pittsburgh. It's just starting. It's the first Super Bowl where these two teams are together. And Gerela is getting ready to walk off the field, but Cliff Harris was trying to block it. He didn't, but he runs into Gerela. Contact is very minimal. And he starts talking to him. And then he pats him on the head. He hits Gerela on top of the head as if to say, hey, thanks, man, for missing that field goal. We really appreciate you doing that, dude. And Lambert sees it and takes him and throws him down on the ground just like a rag doll. And the officials stand pretty close by. And Harris gets up and he points immediately to the official and looks over at Jack Lambert. And Lambert's pointing at Harris, and nobody did a thing. The officials didn't make a call. There was no flag. Ed Too Tall Jones was standing real close by. But who's going to mess with Lambert? It wasn't going to happen, and it completely changed. The Steelers were losing, and they needed those 3 points. They ended up scoring 14 points in the second half, and they only gave up 7. They ended up winning the Super Bowl 21-17, and it was the first of the 2 big games against the Dallas Cowboys that the Pittsburgh Steelers ended up winning Super Bowl championships against. So obviously the folklore and different things that took place, but that 75 team was just as good as the 74 back-to-back championships.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I know kind of the conference alignments and everything that you have now, and the way that the Cowboys and the Steelers don't really see as much anymore, but the history there, the nastiness, there's a whole generation of folks who grew up watching these teams play that they say, hey, who's your rivals? And, the Cowboys fans are not going to say Washington. They're not going to say the Eagles. They're not going to say New York. They're going to say, oh, Pittsburgh. We hate those guys. Can't stand those guys.
Yeah.
And, it's funny the stories that you tell as far as like, hey, what was going on back then, and the officials, most of them in a lot of these situations with that nastiness, the extracurricular stuff, they probably just swallowed the whistle, right? They said, hey, listen, y'all figure it out. I don't really want to get in the middle of this, it's part of the game, and I think we've kind of gone away from that. You kind of have the opposite now. Some guys get away with some pushing and shoving here and there, but it was just an attitude. It was an attitude that they brought to the forefront. It was, we're going to hit you. We'll hit you early. We'll hit you late in the play. Maybe you get a little shove, a little something extra when you're trying to get up after the whistle's already blown. But it's not dirty football, but I don't want to say it's smash mouth. It's a brand that, it's a Steel Curtain brand, right? It's their own thing. That's why they have their own thing. That's what they call them, the Steel Curtain. Just because it was just, it was their own style, and it was what they did and how they attacked you. And it was probably one of the most successful defenses in the history of the game, if not the most.
The echo of the whistle is when you're supposed to stop, but Jack kept going long after that. And it really developed into a intimidation factor in many respects. There's a lot of talking that goes back and forth. And I'm sure Jack on numerous occasions had blocks where he was hit by a guard, a center, and knocked off his feet or whatever, but few and far between. So he'd retaliate and he'd take it out the next time that he made a tackle. And obviously this guy was prone to being around the football all the time. The 74 team wins the Super Bowl. So does 75. They were 12-2 in 75, had a great team. They beat the Colts and the Raiders in the playoffs. And in 76, They started out 1-4, the Steelers did. And they had a closed door meeting. Basically, they players only. And Lambert was the one to get up in front of the group and go, listen, this has to stop right now. We're going to play lights out, and there's nothing else that needs to be said. We're defending champions, and we're not playing like it. Let's turn everything around. They did. They didn't lose another game. They finished 10-4. They only gave up 28 points, two touchdowns, and a total of 28 points in the final 9 games of the season. They end up losing to the Raiders in the playoffs, and the Raiders end up winning the Super Bowl. In 77, they lose to Denver in the playoffs, and Denver ends up going to the Super Bowl. In 78, they were Super Bowl champs again, and so were again in 79 when they beat the Rams. That's the upper left-hand picture that Jeremiah puts together for us, where they're playing against the Rams in Pasadena. Kind of a blowout game. The Rams had a chance. They were ahead at halftime, but the Steelers, their defense, and then that long pass from Bradshaw to John Stallworth ended up being the capstone for that. And it really was the end of the Steelers in terms of their dominance. They'd make it to the AFC Championship game. In 84, they lost. But in 80 and 81, they didn't even make the playoffs. In 82 and 83, they lost in the divisional round. But Jack Lambert was certainly a part of that. In his 11th year, the final one, he ended up having a horrible case of turf toe. Anyone that doesn't know about that, if this is the end of your shoe, your foot, when you hit, it goes and it slides forward just a little bit. But if it goes too far, your toes have nowhere to go. So they push back in to the foot, and the nerve endings in your toes, it's an unbearable situation in many cases. And Jack tried to play with a horrible turf toe. And after saying that the quarterbacks need to be wearing dresses, the way that they're protecting him, the way that he'd push around, he did not have the ability to get on the field, and he ended up retiring. He had a great career for obvious reasons, Brian. And there's one thing about him that is from an intimidation factor and just from a guy that you'd want on your team, the way that he fixes helmet, the way he'd adjust himself, the way that he'd bounce his feet, the way he'd point at guys. Jack Lambert was the prototypical linebacker that every team would want on their franchise's roster.
It's nice that calling out the quarterbacks for being too soft has still stood the test of time, right? It's kind of nice that we can still do that. At least that part of the game is still, because I think it was Clay Matthews a couple of years ago. After a sack or something like that, I think he's throwing his hands up. He's like, "Hey, what do you want me to do? Right? Do I got to tuck him in? How do I bring him to the ground?" But I think it's kind of funny that and Jack, that face mask is iconic, right? There's a certain player that has to wear the cage face mask, right? Where it's big, it's intimidating. You can see his face, but it's just you don't think you'd ever be able to get to it, right? It seems like a million miles away, but he's right there. And you have the neck roll and you have everything else. You were talking earlier about, hey, the jersey's down to your forearms almost, but it's hard to find a picture with him in a Steelers uniform where there's just not tape or a club or just something wrapped. I never saw Jack Lambert's arms, right? If you look at any of the highlights where you see where he's playing with the Steelers, you never see his arms. You never see these guys' arms. Yeah. And the Steelers were the pinnacle of that. They say, hey, listen, these are weapons, right? Your hands are weapons. So we're gonna wrap it up. We're gonna give you as much protection as you possibly can. And they that's just how they were. But I mean, he was maybe with like medical advancements back then, maybe, he could have given a little more time off, or maybe he could have prolonged his career. But I don't know if there's much else Jack could have done, even if he did play longer. I think just based on his accolades, based on what he's able to do, how many Super Bowl wins he had, Pro Bowls, all pro level stuff. I mean, Jack did just about everything he could the time he was in a Pittsburgh Steelers uniform.
Yeah, he was the epitome of every portion of that. And no disrespect to any of the other Steelers, obviously, but we're just honoring Jack right now. And I've always put it this way, that if you're a good player on a good team, you've got a chance to win. But if you have several good players on a good team, you have a chance to be great. And the whole defense was just stacked from head to toe, from front to back, from left to right, from right to left. It didn't matter. They were an amazing group. They played well together. And it was very difficult for any team to score. And as you mentioned from the outset, if you were in Cleveland, if you were in Cincinnati, if you were in Houston, Denver, Oakland, Miami, Baltimore, any of Kansas City, even Buffalo, it was you had to bring your A game when you were going against the Steelers. Final thoughts, Brian, before we honor Jack Lambert for the last time here today.
I think the Steelers started doing what was it? I think they call it the Hall of Honor, right? Like teams call it the Ring of Honor, the Hall of Honor, whatever it is. I think he was one of the inaugural members, right, in 2017 when they started doing that. Which is, I mean, that one of the most storied franchises in the history of the game, right? If you look at success, playoff success, Super Bowls, the amount of players they've had on the team. I mean, to be one of the inaugural members and almost the face, you could argue the face. Bradshaw's kind of the guy because he's more in the media, he's the quarterback, whatever. But I mean, Lambert is, the face, which he has a unique one, obviously, because we talked about earlier with his teeth, but he's a scary dude. And he was the face of that team that was just stacked with Hall of Fame talent on both sides of the ball. And he earned his reputation. He was a heck of a player, and everything he did, that's why we're here talking about him today.
Gorilla's Gorillas, Franco's Italian Army, the Mean Joe Green fan club. You would see people that would take these bed sheets and they would spray paint them with their favorite player. And Lambert's Lunatics was certainly a part of that. Yes, you can love Mel Blount and Donnie Shell. You can love Mean Joe Green or Dwight White, the yellow shoes, the gold shoes that L.C. Greenwood would play in. You could love Franco or Rocky Blyer. Terry Bradshaw obviously was a hero for so many different reasons, but Jack Lambert was certainly a part of that, where everybody, I don't care if you love Franco, you had to take your hat off and go, yeah, that guy, number 58. We wouldn't have been the same without him. So obviously a fantastic career in the National Football League. Here are just a couple of the accolades that are associated with Jack Lambert. 4-time Super Bowl champion, the NFL Defensive Player of the Year. He was a Defensive Rookie of the Year in 1974. He was a first-team All-Pro 6 times. He was a second-team All-Pro 2 more additional times. He went to the Pro Bowl 9 times during his career. He is on the All-70s decade team, All-80s decade team. He is on the 75th anniversary all-time team for the National Football League. He is also in the 100th anniversary all-time team. He was a Pro Football Writers all-rookie team in 1974. He's on the all-time team for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's in their Hall of Honor. He's in the Hall of Fame with the Pittsburgh Steeler. He was a MAC Defensive Player of the Year. He was the Golden Flashes first retired number 99 jersey. He had 1,400 tackles during his career, 8 sacks, 28 interceptions for 243 yards. He had 17 fumble recoveries, and he is also a member of the National Football League Hall of Fame. Brian, that's a pretty good resume.
It's not too bad, right? Not too bad from a guy that couldn't get any offers out of high school,
Yeah.
Not too shabby. Hey, no one wanted him in college, but I think there isn't a team out there that wouldn't have taken him professionally. Well,
they have 4 kids, he and his wife, Lisa. I know that he has worked afterwards. He was a broadcaster for a little while, but also worked in national parks, just kind of be away from everybody. He doesn't go back to Pittsburgh often. There's probably an inner reason for that. He did go back, as you mentioned, for his induction into the Ring of Honor. There are certain things that he will attend, but there's some portion of him that's my football life is over, and I don't need to relive it every week. So there's a certain respect that I have for him for that. But obviously being honored in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, Jack, you well deserve it. So we appreciate everything that you did to make the game of football all that much more enjoyable to watch, and you were a terrific part of it. So we honor John Harold Lambert, born on July 8th, 1952. So for Brian LeBel, our producer and engineer is Jeremiah Long. We appreciate everybody being a part of today's show. This has been our NFL Legacies show here on 100 Yards of Football. Have a great day, everybody. We certainly appreciate you being a part of the show.